Most people don't think much about buttons. They're everywhere, but they rarely feel important. Light switches, elevator panels, the mute button on a call, a single press, a predictable result. The mental model is simple. A button is a shortcut. It saves time. It replaces effort with ease. You press it, and something happens. That assumption feels reasonable because, on the surface, buttons appear passive. They wait. They don't argue. They don't negotiate. They don't seem to shape behavior. They respond. And because of that, we tend to treat them as neutral tools, small conveniences layered onto modern life. But that surface understanding is incomplete. The button isn't just a trigger. It's a boundary. It decides when action begins, when it ends, and what kinds of actions are even possible in the first place. Over time, systems reorganize themselves around that boundary. Workflows adjust, habits form, expectations shift. Eventually, entire environments are designed on the assumption that the button will be there, ready to be pressed. Once that happens, the button stops being a detail. It becomes control infrastructure. The common way people think about buttons is functional and mechanical. A button sends a signal. That signal activates a process. The process produces an outcome. In a factory, it starts a machine. In software, it submits a form. In a car, it starts the engine. Cause and effect appear clean and linear. This way of thinking treats buttons as interchangeable. One could be swapped for another. A switch could replace a knob. A voice command could replace a tap. The assumption is that the underlying system stays the same. Only the interface changes. That assumption works in very small cases. Turning a lamp on or off doesn't alter the structure of electricity. Pressing an elevator button doesn't change the physics of motion. But as buttons become the primary way people interact with systems, the systems begin to adapt to the interface rather than the other way around. Consider how work changed when submit became a button instead of a physical act. Forms used to be reviewed before they were sent. Papers were stacked. Signatures were checked. The friction forced pauses. When submission became instantaneous, the surrounding process didn't just speed up. It reorganized. Review moved downstream. Errors became expected. Corrections became routine. The button didn't just save time. It reshaped responsibility. Or think about emergency systems. The presence of a panic button changes how risk is managed. People behave differently when they believe help is one press away. Organizations design response protocols around that assumption. Training changes. Liability shifts. The button becomes part of the risk calculation, not just a backup. In everyday life, the most influential button isn't labeled as such. It's the confirmation button. Okay, confirm, accept, continue. These buttons appear harmless because they don't seem to initiate anything dramatic. They simply allow something to proceed. But that's exactly their role. They turn complex decisions into binary gates. Before the button, there may be pages of terms, layers of logic, or chains of automated steps. None of that matters until confirmation is pressed. Once it is, the system treats the decision as final even if the person pressing it barely understood the context. This is where the underlying structure starts to matter. Buttons don't just trigger actions. They compress decisions. They hide complexity behind a single moment. Engineers and designers use buttons to move cognitive load away from the system and onto the user, often without the user realizing it. When a system grows large, it needs clear handoff points, places where responsibility transfers. The button becomes that handoff. Before the press, the system is preparing. After the press, the system is executing. Anything that happens in between is abstracted away. This abstraction allows systems to scale. Millions of people can use the same platform because the decision point is standardized. Everyone presses the same button. Everyone agrees implicitly to the same transition. But abstraction also removes visibility. Once actions are reduced to presses, it becomes difficult to see what's actually happening. A single click might trigger dozens of background processes: data replication, notifications, financial transactions, logging, monitoring. None of that is visible at the interface level. From the system's perspective, the button is not small at all. It's a synchronization point. It's where uncertainty collapses into a yes or no. Systems are built to wait for that collapse. This is why so many workflows stall without button input. A process can be fully automated, but it often still waits for a human confirmation. Not because the human adds intelligence, but because the button assigns accountability. It marks the moment where responsibility moves from design to execution. Over time, systems learn to optimize around that moment. Designers place buttons where they want decisions to happen. They shape the timing, wording, and placement to guide behavior, not through persuasion, but through structure. A button placed at the end of a long process feels different than one placed at the beginning. A button that says "Continue" feels different than one that says "Finalize." These differences aren't emotional tricks. They're cognitive shortcuts. They reduce hesitation. They encourage flow. As more systems adopt this model, second-order effects begin to appear. One of the most significant is the erosion of intermediate thinking. When decisions are compressed into presses, people stop engaging with the steps between intention and outcome. The system doesn't require it, so the habit fades. Another effect is the illusion of control. Pressing a button feels active. It feels like doing something. But in many cases, the real decisions have already been made upstream by system design. The button simply authorizes a predetermined path. This can create a mismatch between responsibility and power. People feel responsible because they pressed the button, but they had little influence over what the system actually does. When outcomes are unexpected, blame becomes diffuse. The system executed as designed. The user confirmed. No single point feels accountable. Buttons also encourage immediacy. When action is always one press away, delay starts to feel abnormal. Waiting becomes friction rather than a natural part of process. Systems that once allowed for pause begin to assume instant response. Notifications appear because buttons exist to respond to them. Over time, this changes how organizations and individuals pace themselves. Faster cycles become the default. Reversibility decreases. Mistakes are handled after the fact, rather than prevented beforehand. None of this requires malicious intent. It emerges from efficiency. Buttons are introduced to reduce effort. Systems adapt to that reduction. Complexity shifts, but it doesn't disappear. Seen from this perspective, the small button isn't controlling outcomes directly. It's controlling structure. It decides where decisions happen. It defines when uncertainty ends. It shapes how responsibility is distributed. Understanding this doesn't require rejecting buttons or avoiding them. It requires recognizing that they are not neutral. They are design choices with long shadows. When a system asks for a press, it's not just asking for permission. It's asking to move forward in a very specific way, along a path that has already been laid out. The simplicity of the interface hides the rigidity of the structure beneath it. Once you start noticing this, buttons stop looking like conveniences. They start looking like joints in a machine, small critical points where movement is allowed in one direction and not another. And in a world increasingly built from interconnected systems, those joints quietly determine how almost everything moves.